Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth Energy Technology Perspectives 2012 webinar focusing on the power sector. This is the fourth webinar hosted on this publication, and today we're going to hear from a number of speakers as we work through this chapter and this focus from the publication. My name is David Elzinga. I'm an analyst with the IEA, and I'll be your moderator today for this webinar. We have over 300 people registered for this event, and we're very pleased that so many people are interested in this, in clean power technology issues. Just to note that we will be recording this publication, so you will be able to access this after the publication if you must leave early or for those who cannot attend. I want to just highlight a few key issues for this webinar. You'll be able to follow the presentation on your computer screen by clicking on the link you received on your registration email. Once you've joined the webinar, you should also see a questions window. This is where you can type questions at any time throughout the webinar. With so many people joining this event, we won't be able to answer all the questions, but what we're going to do is read through the questions that we receive and then try to group them and pick up some of the dominant themes. Of course, throughout or after the webinar, if you have any more detailed questions, feel free to email the ETP team at etp_project@iea.org. So, as I've mentioned, this topic is part of the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Perspectives 2012, which was launched at June this year. This is the fourth edition of the book and is one of the IEA's flagship energy technology publications. At the center of this analysis is our 2-degree scenario, or the 2DS. This focuses on energy technology choices that can ensure an 80% chance of limiting long-term global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. So the book is very much about how we can achieve the clean energy revolution. This webinar, as I mentioned, will focus on one sector, the power sector, in its crucial role. Today you're going to hear from two main speakers. Marcus Racca is the project leader of the Energy Technology Perspectives publication, and Uwe Remy, who is going to focus on the main findings of the electricity section. So we're going to run through two presentations, or one large presentation, focusing on an introduction as well as the key findings, and then we'll have a discussion here with Marcus, Uwe, and of course two other authors, Keith Bernard and Steve Heinen. So with this now, I'm going to turn it over to Marcus, who will start with the introduction to the overall publication. Marcus.
Thanks, Dave. I'll just try to get the technology working. We're a technology publication after all. So good afternoon, everybody. I was just going to say good to see so many here. It's difficult. I only see 6 people in this room actually, but I see that we are close to 150 people listening in, so that's very nice. As Dave mentioned, I'm Marcus. I've been living and breathing ETP for the better part of the last year and a half, and I'm very proud of this project in general and the analysis that we hopefully provide to a wider audience in particular. So I'm going to give a relatively short intro and overview of the whole project before Uwe takes over and takes us into the more details around the power sector. So, like Dave said, this is the core of ETP is a scenario study. And in order to frame the discussion and make it easier to understand it, we have 3 main scenarios around which the analysis revolves. At the center is the 2-degree scenario. This is a vision articulated for a sustainable energy system, and we define that as a halving in CO2 emissions from energy-related activities between now and 2050. We contrast that with 2 other scenarios. The 4-degree scenario, which is a scenario that reflects current pledges by governments to cut emissions and improve energy efficiency. And finally, the 6-degree scenario, which is what we project would happen if no new policies at all were implemented beyond what's already in place today. So this is a fairly scary outlook, but unfortunately the one at which we're heading today if nothing more is done. So here I'd just like to underline also that although we define these and name them after the carbon emissions, a sustainable future is not only about carbon, of course. We also look in the book at other aspects of these scenarios. For example, energy security implications of these different scenarios. So you'll find a lot more than just climate change and climate policy in this analysis. But before we look into the projections, let's look back a little bit. What's happened over the last 40 years? So what you see in the panel here, or the panels, to the left you have total primary energy supply, so basically how much energy has been supplied to the world and used by the world from 1971 to 2009, and the associated CO2 emissions from energy-related activities to the right. And of course the striking picture here is, or the striking message here is that these graphs tend to increase fairly dramatically. So we've seen a doubling of energy demand over the last 40 years. We still see a lot of growth, especially in the non-OECD world. So the last 10 or 15 years, most of the growth has been in the non-OECD world, and that we expect to continue. CO2 emissions have more than doubled in the same period. And this is really the trends that we need to turn around fairly rapidly and dramatically, and that's what our analysis is focused around. How do we do that? How do we bend these curves down, if you wish? We focus on technology and technology's role in meeting the policy or delivering on the policy objectives, and one way of showing the different contributions of technologies to reducing emissions is what we try and capture in this slide here. So what you see at the top, or the top line in this graph, are the emissions in the 6-degree scenario. So this is the most scary of the three scenarios that we have. And then at the bottom you have the emissions trajectory in the 2-degree scenario. And the wedges in between are the contributions that we see different technologies could give to these emissions reductions. Now there are a lot of difficulties in doing this kind of analysis, and depending on how you choose the references, of course these wedges will look different. But the key message here is really that we'll need a portfolio of technology. So there's quite a range of different solutions. They all need to be implemented if this is to be realized, this 2-degree scenario. This is a very long-term project, of course, and what you see on this slide is a long-term outlook. But we also try to stay focused on what's happening now and what needs to be done now. And one chapter needs to be dedicated to tracking the progress currently in clean energy. And when we do that, and try to capture that in one slide, this is what you come up with. So what you see is a grouping in 4 different categories of technologies. You have power at the top, industry, buildings, and transport. And then under each of these sectors, we have different technologies, and we mark them red, yellow, and green, depending on to what extent they're on track to meet the targets that we have laid out in the 2-degree scenario in 2020. So this is a fairly depressing picture. As you see, the only category of technologies that we deem are on track is really renewable power generation. So notably, wind and solar have made a lot of progress over the last years, and the projections that we have are fairly optimistic and look pretty good actually. But all the others are either very way behind. So CCS and power generation and carbon capture and storage in industry, for example, is not at all where we need them to be. Same goes for biofuels and transport and so on and so forth. So this is really a fairly alarming picture, and it sort of shows how much action is needed in terms of both deploying technologies but also developing some of the technologies that we know we are going to need 10, 15, 20 years from now. And against that background, this message is fairly alarming as well. So what you see in this slide are investments, public investments in energy-related RD&D, so research, development, and deployment in the OECD. So you have both the absolute numbers, that's the yellow bars between 1974 and 2010, and then the blue line shows their share of public investments in RD&D that goes to energy-related research. So what you see is that in 1980 we had well above 11% of the RD&D money going into energy-related research, whereas now it's actually below 4%. So this contrasts starkly against the needs that we see in actually stepping up these efforts to produce good RD&D. It's interesting to see the spike in 2009 that you see there to the right. A lot of that is due to the stimulus packages in the US and Europe in particular. So a lot of money went into RD&D during that time period. It'll be interesting to see if the fall that we had in 2010 will continue as we now get data for last year and this year, which we don't currently have. So what kind of energy system are we looking at in this very low carbon future? Well, very stylized. You see today's system here. It's a highly centralized system where energy basically flows from generation on one side in one direction to users on the other side of the system. That needs to change quite fundamentally to a system which we're trying to depict here, which is much more complex in a way. It's much more integrated and multi-directional. So the distinction between generators of energy and users of energy will become more fuzzy. It will require a lot more intelligent infrastructure in terms of better grids, information technologies to manage the system, and also new kinds of policies that can incentivize the build-out of this much more diverse system. So it's diverse both in terms of more sources, but also diverse in terms of more actors involved in the decisions and the management of the system. So this is quite a fundamental shift in how the energy system works, and something that we pay a lot of attention to in the analysis. So this runs as a theme throughout ETP 2012, looking at the synergies and interaction between technologies and actors in the energy market. Of course, at the core of this system is electricity. And Uwe is going to talk much more about this, so I won't spend too much time, but what you see here is the projection of generating technologies in the global power system in the 2-degree scenario. So not surprisingly, we'll see a shift from a heavily fossil-dependent system that we have today to a much more diverse and low-carbon system in 2050. So just to give you a couple of numbers, today about 20%, or actually below 20% of global electricity is supplied through renewable power. That needs to be more than half. I think we're close to 60% of generation in 2050 supplied by renewable technologies. That, of course, is an immense challenge, and again, we'll come back to that in a minute, how we see that could play out. One, as a bridge to the next slide, you can just notice on the bottom there, the green, you have two shades of green. You have the darker green, which is coal, and the lighter green, which is also coal, but coal equipped with carbon capture and storage. And as you see in 2050, basically all the coal that we still use will need to be equipped with carbon capture and storage. Otherwise, there's simply no room in terms of emissions for that fuel. So if you look closer at the carbon capture and storage, and by the way, I should mention that we did a special webinar on carbon capture and storage, and you can look at that on our website. You can listen in to that webinar. But so with this slide, there's really two messages here. What you see here is a ramp up of captured carbon through CCS in different parts of the world. And the first message is that this needs to happen quickly and very dramatically. We need to increase the deployment of carbon capture and storage. Right now, we have no large-scale demonstration plants in electricity and only a few in industry. So we're not at all where we hoped to be only a few years ago in terms of CCS deployment. So we've actually reduced the deployment of CCS in our scenarios compared to a couple of years ago as a reflection of the more bleak outlook in some regions for carbon capture storage. That is not the same as saying that we don't believe in the potential of carbon capture and storage. We certainly see this as a key piece of the puzzle, but it underlines the need for government to step up their efforts. So, and the second message here is that, as you see here, again, we have two different shades of green, and one is carbon captured in power generation, and the lighter green is captured carbon in industry. And as you see, in many regions, industry is as large or even larger than power generation. So the message is that CCS is not, as many people often tend to believe, a technology only focusing on coal-fired power generation. No, it's also about industry, and certainly also about natural gas, as we'll talk about more in a minute. A feature that we haven't had before in ETP, and that we're really pleased that we have this year, is heating and cooling. So we have a special chapter on heating and cooling. We believe that heating and cooling has not received the attention it deserves in much analysis in the energy sector, and certainly the IEA has been a culprit as well, because not many people believe that, or also understand that almost half of energy used in the world is actually going to heating and cooling. So the potential to reduce emissions, unless you start paying attention to this, is likely going to stay foregone, because there's a lot of waste here. It's very difficult to get good data on heating and cooling. We don't collect half as good data as we do for electricity, for example, but even conservative estimates of how much heat is wasted show that the potential is huge. Cooling is particularly interesting when you look at the latent potential for growth. Today, cooling is much lower in terms of demand than for heating, but when you look at where most of the economic growth and also the population growth is going to happen over the last 40 or 50 years, it's going to be in largely developing economies and in hot countries. Also, the urbanization is going to add to the increased demand for cooling. So one of the first things that people tend to invest in as they get more money is an air conditioning unit. So we see a potential explosion in the increased demand for cooling equipment that will largely be, if we just continue in the way that we do it now, that's going to cause a lot of problems in terms of energy use in a lot of these emerging economies. So we really stress that governments need to start paying more attention to heating and cooling, and try to develop efficient markets, not only for electricity but also for heating and cooling services. Now turning to another sector that we'll also have a webinar on in about a month from now, so we'll post that on our website. That's transport. So just to give you a taste here, what you see here is the mix of vehicle technologies in the 2° scenario again. So what you see is sales of passenger light-duty vehicles, so basically cars, between now and 2050. And the main message here is really that we're going to have a portfolio of technology. So we don't believe that there's only room for one particular technology in terms of vehicles, but a suite of them. That's not the same as saying that all countries will have all of these technologies, but there's certainly room for different routes to this low-carbon system. A second message is that we're going to see a lot of electrification of the propulsion systems. So no matter what fuel that we put into the transport system, a lot of the motors that will be sitting in the cars in 2050 will be electric. Whether that's a plug-in or a hybrid could differ, but certainly electrification is a central piece of this. And that, of course, will also have new challenges for the electricity system in terms of supplying and balancing the new demand patterns. If you look closer at the short term for electric vehicles, which we do, you can start by looking at the government targets. So what you see here are the government targets on electric vehicle sales between 2010 and 2020 when we add them up. So what we've done is looked at all the policies that governments have put in place and the targets that they're aiming for in 2020. We'll add them up. And this is actually pretty encouraging. If these numbers are realized, it's almost spot on what we have in our 2-degree scenario. So this would deliver the volumes of vehicles required to sustain an industry. It would deliver the suite of models in the car industry that would increase consumer confidence enough for them to buy them, and so on and so forth. So this is pretty good news. The bad news, however, is that when we ask our industry partners that we work very closely with in our modeling about what capacity they are planning to put in place to supply electric vehicles, the picture is very different. In fact, it's this. So the orange bars here are the sales or the capacity to produce electric vehicles told to us by our industry partners. So as you see, the difference is pretty striking. In fact, government targets in 2020 are about 5 times as high as they are as industry is telling us they're planning for. Now, you could argue, well, industry is more flexible than this. This is an overly pessimistic picture, which to some extent is true. But it's also true that it takes time to turn around industry. It takes time to develop the models and get them onto the market. It takes time to build the factories that are required to produce these vehicles. So this tells the more general message that unless government targets are backed up by really stringent policies and credible policies, industry will not deliver the action on the ground that those targets will require. So before I leave the word to Uwe, I'm going to try to give at least half an answer to one of the questions that we almost always get when we have hopefully convinced people that this realizing the 2-degree scenario is possible from a technical perspective, which is, well, what is this all going to cost? So what you see here is our attempt to at least start answering this question. At the top bar here shows the additional investments needed to realize the 2-degree scenario above the 6-degree scenario. So how much more would we need to invest in the energy system if climate policy is a priority and we need to realize the 2-degree scenario? It's a staggering amount of money. 36 trillion US dollars is what we come up with. That's about $130 per every person on the planet every year between now and 2050. So that's the bad news. The good news is that the fuel savings that these investments could potentially deliver are a lot higher. In fact, if you look at the mid bar, so the second bar from the top, you'll see that those fuel savings amount to about 100 trillion US dollars. So even if you discount that at a fairly high discount rate from a social finance perspective, so 10% say, which is what we've done at the bottom bar there, you still end up with a net saving between now and 2050. So you could argue, well, there are a lot of caveats on this and it's difficult analysis to do. That's true. But the key message here is that even given the uncertainties in this kind of analysis, we believe that it's very hard to make the case that this is an impossible scenario from an absolute cost perspective. That's a very difficult case to make. Now, that's not the same as saying this will happen by itself. The distributional aspects are enormously challenging. We have uneven distribution over time, so the benefits of these investments will fall to future generations in some cases. There's uneven distribution in space, so some countries will have to invest more than others, and the benefits will fall evenly over the planet. So all these distributional aspects are hugely important, and that's why the role of governments are so important if the scenario is to be realized. So to close off with some key messages out of the ETP publication, we still believe that it's possible to realize a 2-degree scenario. The technologies either already exist or can be developed at a reasonable cost between now and 2050. Despite the potential of technology that we see, progress is depressingly slow. We don't have at all the progress that we need to see in some of the major technologies with a big potential to reduce emissions and increase efficiency. Systemic thinking, so thinking in a holistic way and think about the system as a whole rather than at each technology on its own is really important, and in fact we believe it's critical to reap these synergies if these benefits are going to be realized. But again, even from an economic perspective, this makes sense. I put financial here, makes financial sense. In fact, that's true to some extent, but it's also a fact that the financing of some of these technologies is really the main barrier. Just the cost of capital is a huge barrier to some of these technologies, which tend to be more capital intensive than traditional ones in the energy system. And finally, government policies really need to be decisive if we are to unlock the potential of technology. This will not happen by itself. Government's role have to be recognized, and the governments need to see that they are going to be a key player in the transformation of the energy system. So with that, and with a plug for our website, you can find much more on our website, including interactive visualization tools and all the figures and graphs of the book. With that, I'll leave the word to our real brain in the team here, Dr. Uwe Remme, who will take you through some of the details on the power system.
Great. And while we're just transitioning here, I'll just comment that one question that's come up on our screen is whether this analysis is for just OECD countries or just IEA member countries. And the analysis that we do is global analysis, and we try to make it very clear and indicate which specific regions we are talking about. But when we don't, this is global analysis. We definitely look beyond our borders of our member countries. So with that, let me please give the floor to Uwe Remme.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will talk a bit more about our findings in the power sector. If we look today at the electricity system, it's actually a central part of the energy sector. So around 40% of the primary energy consumption is linked to the electricity sector, and of the fuels that are going into the electricity system, around 80% are based on fossil fuels. So that means we take into account that we've got losses, inevitable losses in converting these fuels into electricity. Around 40% of the global CO2 emissions are linked to the electricity sector. So that illustrates how important the electricity sector is in terms of energy security. So the sector consumes 40% of the energy, but also in terms of the carbon impact. So it's really an important sector. And if we look at the recent trends before talking about the future, the electricity generation has increased by 8,000 terawatt hours over the last 2 decades, and the majority of its increase actually has been covered by fossil fuels, and around 60% of its increase has been covered by coal. So you see again that we are at the moment really on a trend where we rather increase the carbon intensity of the power sector, not decreasing it. If we look at it on a regional level, the fuel of choice for covering the increase in electricity generation was in the OECD, mainly covered by gas. That's due to the uptake of shale gas in the US. And in Europe also the factor that due to the liberalization of the electricity market, the gas price often very well correlated with the electricity prices possibility for generators to hedge against volatile electricity prices by using gas. If you look at the non-OECD region, we also see to some extent contrary picture. There, the increase in electricity generation has been largely covered by coal, especially due to economic growth in China and also India. If you look at renewables, they only rank third in this incremental generation increase. Also, one has to say that over very recent years, there was a very strong growth, for example, in solar and wind, so that if we look at the capacity that has been added in 2010, around half of the 200 gigawatts of new capacity added in the global power system has been based on renewable energy sources. So that's a promising sign, as we already, when we talked about the progress tracking, renewables is one area we see at least that we are, for some technologies in this area, on track. If you look at the historic development of the capacity additions, for example, in China and India, we see what I already saw on the previous chart, that the increase in generation or new capacity additions are largely based on coal at the moment in these two countries. And a large part of this coal capacity is actually still subcritical technology. It means that's the least efficient one. On the other hand, encouraging fact is that these countries have started now to introduce policies either to close inefficient or small power plants, or also to make supercritical or even ultra supercritical power technologies mandatory for new projects. If we look at the OECD countries like US or also the European region, there the challenge is rather that we are facing an aging capacity stock, so the challenge there to replace and modernize the existing generation sector. So it means there's a challenge to finance financing for these new capacity additions, but it also opens the opportunity to modernize the electricity system. I mean, the same is true also for the non-OECD region, that the future growth and generation capacity can also be covered, or ideally should be covered by, to see later in the 2D scenario, by low-carbon technologies. Okay, now we're starting with the looking at some of the scenarios. So what you see here is the incremental electricity demand between today and 2050 in the 2D scenario for different countries or regions in the world. If we look at non-OECD countries like China and India, we see that growth in industry still plays an important role in these two countries. On the other hand, if we look at OECD countries, most of the increase in electricity demand is coming from the end-use sectors, especially the building sector and the transport sector. So it means that in these sectors, despite efficiency improvements in the use of electricity, we've seen increase in electricity use, so in electrification, for example, in the building sector through the increased use of heat pumps, or in the transport sector due to the electrification by electric vehicles. So just to illustrate, for example, the transport sector in 2050 in the 2D scenario will be around 2 billion cars on the road, and around half of the vehicles will either be plug-in hybrid or electric vehicles. So it illustrates drastic change that we see in some sectors due to the introduction of electricity as an option to reduce carbon emissions in those sectors. Overall, if you look at the global final energy mix, electricity will be responsible for around 1/4 of the final energy demand, compared to around 17% today. So coming to the generation side of the system, so if we look at the 4D scenario, the electricity generation will still be dominated by fossil fuels. Also, in this scenario, we already assume, or we need a CO2 price of around $60 per ton of CO2 in 2050. If we look at the mix between coal and gas, we see that the decline in the share in the mix largely goes at the expense of coal, while gas remains able to remain its current share of around 20%. If we look at the CO2 intensity scenario, the global CO2 intensity, or the average CO2 intensity, falls from around 500 grams per kilowatt hour to around 280 grams in 2050. A drastically different picture emerges if we look at the 2D scenario. So there, around 75% of electricity generation will be based on renewable technologies, around 1/5 on nuclear, and the rest will be based on fossil fuel technologies, coal and gas, with a large share of them being equipped or being plants equipped with carbon capture and storage. So in this scenario, we really approach a low-carbon electricity system with an average CO2 intensity in 2050 of around 60 grams per kilowatt hour. Again, compared to 500 grams today, so we see a reduction of more than 80% in the emissions in the sector. If you look just at the regional mix in different countries, region of the world, we see that it differs between the countries depending on the opportunities and all the challenges in the local areas. For example, hydro will continue to play an important role in Brazil, whereas wind becomes an important option in the US or Europe. And for example, CTS nuclear will be important in China to decarbonize their electricity system. If you look at the capacity additions that are needed to reach the 2DS, we see that a massive deployment of low-carbon technologies is needed over the 4 decades. What we see in this graph are the annual construction rates for the next decade. So you see that massive investments are needed. For example, if you look at wind, also solar PV, so that might be at a first glance quite discouraging whether we will be able to achieve these deployment rates. On the other hand, if we look at conventional technologies like coal and gas, there we have observed over the last 5 years construction rates of around 75 gigawatts for coal and 50 gigawatts for gas. So it's not really out of reach from technical perspective. We think it's possible to reach the 2DS scenario. On the other hand, financing will be a challenge. So the additional investments that we need in the power sector for the 2-degree scenario compared to the 6-degree scenario are around $8 trillion US dollars. If you look at the total investment in the 2DS scenario, so the investments that are needed between today and 2050 in this scenario in the power sector are around 35 trillion US dollars, of which around 25 trillion are needed on the generation side and around 10 for the transmission and distribution system. If you look at the environmental impact of the power sector, so the power sector avoids over the next 4 decades around 250 gigatons of CO2 between, if we compare the 4-degree scenario and the 2-degree scenario. So that overall is the power sector is responsible for 42% of the reductions that are needed in the global energy system across all sectors to reach the 2-degree scenario. In addition, around 6% of reductions are achieved by the additional electrification of the end-use sectors. Again, it means introduction of heat pumps in the building sector or electrification of transport. So that overall one can say that around half of the reduction that are needed to achieve the 2DS scenario are actually linked in some way to the electricity system. Not necessarily all of the reductions are occurring on the generation side. Around, as you see in this graph, around 1/4 of the reductions are actually realized by electricity savings, so meaning using more electricity more efficient in the end-use sectors or substituting electricity by other renewable sources, for example, by solar water heating instead of using electricity for water heating. If you look just at the generation side, reductions there, a large part of the reductions is based on coming from renewable, that's around 30%, around 18% is from nuclear and around 14% from CCS. Also keep in mind, if you look at the gray area here in the graph, that already quite some reductions are achieved if we go from the 6-degree scenario to the 4-degree scenario. So this reduction is achieved by renewables, which are responsible for 30% of this reduction between the two scenarios, and around half of it is coming from electricity savings. So again, overall, as you already saw in the very early graph, efficiency improvements are very important of the entire to achieve the 2DS scenario across all sectors. If you look at the role of gas in our scenarios, we see two very different futures. So in the 2-degree scenario, gas still accounts for around 12% of the generation mix in 2050. But if you look at the 4-degree scenario, we see an increasing generation from gas. So gas becomes in this scenario in some countries a baseload technology. And also substitutes coal. If we look at the 2-degree scenario, we see that at some point gas becomes, due to its carbon content, also in this very low carbon scenario, a problem, and not anymore. It's not then anymore part of the solution to reduce CO2 emissions, but it's really its CO2 intensity is too high to contribute to CO2 reduction. So there we see a changing pattern that gas is more used, for example, as a peak load plant to facilitate also the introduction of variable renewables in the electricity system. Coming to renewables, what you see here is a graph from the medium-term renewable report of the IEA, which was also released this summer. And again, there we see quite positive trends if we look at the renewables, and also the prospects over the next 5 years are quite encouraging. So the graph shows the number of countries with the accumulated capacity of more than 100 megawatts. And we see here, for example, that the number of countries, for example, where wind is installed, increases from around 45 countries in 2011 to more than 70 countries in 2017. Also for solar PV, we've seen increasing, promising development, an increase from 20 countries today to 45 countries in 2017. Interesting feature is also, if you look at the regional distribution, that emerging economies, so non-OECD countries, are becoming more and more important. So we see that wind will be deployed in Latin America, for example, and solar PV is important becomes important in Africa, much more important in Africa, Middle East, and also Asia. If we look at the more long-term trends, for renewables, we see here regional distribution of electricity generation from renewable sources. As I said before, the global average of renewables in the electricity system will be around almost 60% in 2050, but it varies among regions depending on the local potentials for renewables. But a common element is that we see in many countries is an increasing share of variable renewable sources in the electricity system, which poses additional challenges to balance the fluctuations of these variable generation technologies like wind, solar PV, and also ocean and tidal energy. The challenge of balancing, or the need for flexibility in the electricity system, is not something new in the power sector. Actually, already today the electricity system has to cope with variations in the electricity demand. But the additional challenge that occurs due to the introduction of more variable renewable source in the electricity system is that they are often much more difficult to predict. If you look at on the demand side, the variations are typically can be extrapolated from historic time series. It becomes more difficult if you look at the fluctuations from variable renewable sources. If you look at the options to increase the flexibility of the electricity system, the main options are to have more flexible generation, for example, gas turbine plants, or to have more energy storage, which can mean pumped storage. But we can also, in some countries, we already see it today, that the linkage between, for example, the electricity system and heat storage, for example, in Denmark, where electricity is used to produce heat, surplus heat from wind turbines, can be an attractive option. Other options to increase flexibility are demand-side management, so meaning that we shift electricity demand from time periods to other time periods. For example, we can shift space or water heating demand, taking advantage of the inertia of the building shell that can serve as a thermal storage. So there are options available overall to cope with the flexibility needs due to the increasing share of variable renewables. One solution or contribution, options can contribute to increase the flexibility of the system is the transmission and distribution system. What you see here are the investment needs in the 4-degree and 2-degree scenario in different parts of the world. And we to compare the two scenarios, you see the difference in the investment needs is not so different between the 4-degree and 2-degree scenario, and also the trends are somehow different between different regions. Again, it depends really on the local conditions. For example, a factor that could decrease the investment needs would be more decentralized production, so there would be less need for transmission investments, slightly higher investment needs for the distribution system. On the other hand, one can see increased need for transmission capacity to link or to connect remote renewable resources to the consumers. It's also interesting if one looks at the split between the different investment needs or the type of investment that are needed. Quite some difference between the OECD and non-OECD regions. So in the challenge again is in OECD regions more the refurbishment of existing or replacement of existing capacity, while in the countries like China and India the challenge is to expand the electricity transmission distribution system. One also sees in the 2-degree scenario that one needs additional investments for the integration of renewable sources. Also, the share across the countries with around 10% of the investment need is, let's say, rather moderate. Smart grids can be also in a 2DS scenario are an important part of the transmission distribution system. They allow for a more efficient management of the DT and of the transmission distribution system by, for example, avoiding congestion of the transmission line, so that existing capacity can be used more efficiently. And on the other hand, they can also, we just talked about flexibility, they can also be an efficient means to manage the flexibility needs in the electricity system. What you see here in this graph is in addition to the previous graph, the costs and benefits associated with the smart grid. So if we look at the costs, that are the investment costs needed for the additional equipment, for example, like smart meters. If we look at the benefits, that are benefits meaning that we operate the transmission system more efficient, so it means that we save, also in the generation side of electricity, we save fuels. It also means that we utilize the capacity of the system better. Again, it means we can avoid additional transmission investments by increasing the availability factor of the system. But also on the generation side, we reduce the need for additional capacity of generation investments by reducing the losses on the transmission side. If one compares the cost and benefits, one clearly sees that the benefits more than compensate the investment need. But it also has to be clear that, as you see here, due to these two ranges, minimum and maximum estimates, that there's still some uncertainty, especially if we look at the benefits of the smart grid. So that's an area where still more research and work is needed to better identify what could be the future benefits of smart grids. So I started my presentation talking about coal. So I would at the end very briefly have a glance at what could be future trends for coal in the power system. You see there two very radically different futures for coal. If you look at the 6-degree scenario, that's the upper line that you see here. We see a continuing trend of using coal in the power sector. Again, that's then also linked with increasing CO2 emissions in the power sector. And if we look at the 2-degree scenario, we see a peak in generation from coal and then a stabilizing after 2035 roughly due to the use of CCS. So that in the end, if we look, for example, on the right graph at the 2DS scenario, we see that almost all of the remaining coal generation is based on plants that are equipped with CCS. So if we look at CCS in the power sector, around almost 1,000 gigawatts of coal capacity will be installed globally. Around 1/3 will be installed alone in China. And if we look at the trend over time, initially CCS has to be deployed we see it's deployed in OECD countries, but afterwards it quickly has to move to non-OECD countries like China. CCS is an important component to decarbonize the power sector in our analysis. As I said, it's responsible for around 18% of the cumulative CO2 reductions between the 4DS and the 2DS. It's possible to decarbonize the power sector also without CCS, but increases the investment needs to achieve the 2DS scenario. So we analyzed the additional investment costs and estimated that the additional investment costs are around 40%, or around $3 trillion that are needed to achieve the 2DS scenario. So it's quite a substantial amount. So in that sense, Also, we see a lack of progress in the demonstration and deployment of CCS in the power sector. Today, we still think it could be an option to decarbonize, an option that can contribute significantly to decarbonizing of the power sector. So we still think it's important to further work in that direction. So to summarize my presentation, just some of the key findings. So for the power sector, it's important that there isn't there's a long-term climate commitment in the country. So ideally, in the long run, a CO2 price is needed. So, for example, to reach the reductions in the 2D scenario, we need a CO2 price globally of around $150 per ton of CO2. If we look at renewables, that was an area where we already see today some progress for some renewable technologies, but still for some other technologies, more support in the form of, for example, feed-in tariffs or other incentives is needed. And there it's very important that the policies are designed in a transparent and predictable way, so that there is also investment security for private investors. If you look at the current trends for over the recent years, one sees very much the danger of a lock-in in carbon-intensive technologies. Again, most of the growth of recent years has been, in terms of absolute terms, is based on coal-fired generation. Also, in the 2-year scenario, if we want to reach the reduction target, we already have to decommission around 800 gigawatts of coal capacity before the end of the technical lifetime. So the longer we wait for the transition of our power system, the more expensive it will become in the future. I already mentioned just CCS, so that still we think can be an important option to decarbonize the power sector. I've not that much talked about nuclear in my presentation. So nuclear still accounts for around 20% of the electricity generation mix in 2050, and also is responsible for around 40% of the CO2 reductions in the 2D scenario. I guess it's also important to take care of the lessons that we learned from the Fukushima accidents and share them internationally, and also to rapidly try to implement the findings that we get from the stress tests. So with that, I conclude, and I guess we continue. Give it to Dave.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Uwe. We've definitely heard a lot of information here in these two presentations, and looking at the questions from the audience, we have, for one, we have many questions. I don't think that we'll be able to address all of them, but so we've grouped a number of questions. So I'm going to start out with choosing one. And I'll hand this over to Marcus. Could you just give a quick overview of what this model is? Is it a projection of what's going to happen? What exactly are we saying with this model?
Well, it's not a projection. We're not after saying this is the most likely scenario between now and 2050. What we're trying to show is a feasible pathway to the policy objective of reducing emissions dramatically to be consistent with the 2-degree scenario. And we're trying to show the cheapest way of doing that. So we're aiming to produce a pathway and a policy, technology mix that is the least cost way of reaching this target. So to answer your question, Dave, no, it's not we're not doing projections here. We're doing scenario modeling. So if you want to do this, this is the cheapest way of doing it.
Great. No, thank you. And Uwe, just before we get into some of the details, can you just comment a little bit on some of the high-level assumptions that go into the model? You touched on the carbon price, but also what drives some of the technology choices that come out in these scenarios?
Yeah, thank you. I haven't elaborated that much on the methodology that underlies our analysis for the power sector. So actually, it's very much driven by cost. So we use the least cost optimization framework to develop these scenarios. So it means for the different power technologies, important input assumptions are economic parameters like investment costs, the remaining technology, the lifetime of technology, or more technologically correct parameters like efficiencies and so on, so that these factors are technology factors are driving the generation costs. Overall, we look also at the factors like the necessary certain need for a certain reserve margin in the overall system, and also at the how to balance the fluctuations on the generation side and the demand side. So that overall, the main driver of the scenarios are the costs, and means if we want to reach a certain reduction of CO2 emissions in the power sector, we then also have to internalize the CO2 emissions by using a carbon price.
Okay, great. I appreciate that, because I think it's important to set up the discussion around some of the more detailed technology questions around some of these high-level aspects of the modeling framework. So I'm going to ask Keith, do you see a realistic scenario without coal? Because of course it's the topic of renewables is something that is much more in the media, and I think coal, we still see it showing up in our modeling all the way out to 2050. So if you could comment, is it possible to meet our goals without coal? Is it possible even to operate the energy system without coal? And some words around that question.
Okay, thank you. Well, without coal, that's a big question. As Uwe has just said, the modelling is cost optimized for least cost means to achieve the goals. So for the low carbon scenario, for the 2DS scenario in ETP, then coal still plays a part, but a much reduced role, where if you compare it to the 4DS or the 6DS scenarios. The generation from coal reduces by about 50%, and coal usage actually reduces to levels that were last seen maybe 20 years or more ago. So there is, in real terms, a huge reduction in the use of coal in the 2DS scenario. You also need to remember that, well, if we look at current trends, current trends aren't actually following the 2DS scenario. They're much closer or even higher for coal than the 6DS. And that's because we have countries such as China and India in the future who are using increasing amounts of coal to for their electricity, for their industry, for their development. These countries have large domestic stocks, supplies of coal. They have indigenous supplies of coal. They are, in some ways, the cheap option for China and India to be able to produce electricity and maintain their energy security. So I think that there are 2 points. There's the cost optimized model. If we do away with coal altogether, then clearly it's going to be a more expensive way. It will mean it will be a higher cost to achieve the 2DS, but I think it will be very difficult, given there are countries that rely heavily on coal to lift themselves out of poverty and to industrialize their future.
Great, thank you for that, Keith. Now, with that said, you commented a bit on some of the investments that are happening now, and as well, we know that with the huge demand growth in some of the non-OECD member countries, we're seeing significant investments today Marcus, do we include in our analysis some early retirement of those investments, and how does that play out in our analysis?
Yes, we do, is the short answer. I think Uwe even mentioned a number on it. About 800 gigawatts of coal, I think, is retired before its technical lifetime in our scenarios. I don't know how many years early, actually, on average, we retire them. Maybe you have that number, Uwe? I'm sure you do somewhere, but...
I don't know if years, but we looked at what would be the financial impact of retiring this coal capacity before the end of their technical lifetime, and we came up with lost revenues from lost sales of around $3 trillion US. So that's a huge number. If we again compare it with the additional investment needs of around $8 trillion US to reach the 2DS scenario. On the other hand, if these plants would continue to be operated, if we just would penalize the emissions of these plants with a CO2 price, you would have kind of additional CO2 tax you have to pay for around more than 8 trillion or 7 to 8 trillion US dollars. So in the end, it pays off to shut down these plants before the end of technical lifetime from the overall perspective of the electricity system. On the other hand, it will be very challenging in countries like China or India how to introduce these policies that these plants are shut down, because I mean they still have an economic value absolutely today, and even not just an economic value. If you look at India, we also have the challenge that every kilowatt hour of electricity is actually needed in the system. So that's an additional consideration.
Well, just on this topic, Dave, one particularly interesting fuel, I guess we could say from this perspective, is natural gas. The slide that Uwe showed before about the different, the different use that we see for natural gas in two scenarios highlight kind of the different routes that and different business cases, if you wish, that exist depending on what scenario you see the world going into. So if you're a natural gas investor, of course, it makes a huge difference if you're looking to do a base load type of plant that's going to run, for 6,000 hours a year, or if you're going to move to a peak load type plant, which will run for a fraction of that time. So, coming back to your question about the early retirement, sometimes it's not about just shutting them down, but also how we operate the plants, and that will be, depending on the scenario. I think that raises questions around for how long can we invest in certain types of infrastructure, natural gas being one of the best examples. I think that does it really make sense to invest heavily in not only the gas plant but also the infrastructure around it if we don't see a good business case for it going out 20-30 years?
So on that point, Steve, would you be able to comment just on how you see, or what are the key issues that need to be addressed for natural gas in particular? I'm thinking of that slide where we see it, of course, playing a very big role in the 4DS, but then a very reduced role in the 2DS. What is that? Why is that happening, and what does that mean? What are the things that need to be addressed for that scenario?
So I'm just focusing here now on the power sector, to be clear. And so the 4DS, I would say, is kind of the golden gas of the combined cycle gas turbines. So we're going to use the gas for baseload power generation, and as we've seen in the slides before, the use will increase, especially in non-OECD countries. And so we see what we see already in OECD countries, that gas is pushing out coal, but also potentially other baseload technologies. But in the 2DS, we see a much more flexible use of gas turbines, and we have very, very low capacity factors going in OECD countries up to 10 to 15%, and even falling in non-OECD countries. So that cyclic operation has obviously some downside, so lower efficiencies, the fatigue of the turbine components, and on top of that we'll need additional investment in the whole gas supply chain, so talking about the storage vessels, the pipelines, but also potentially the whole transport, marine transport of LNG. And so this will have consequences, but the good news is that there is still a role for gas in the 2DS, and it's a very important one, because gas is kind of will allow us to keep the lights on in a system based on very variable generation. So because of that, we think that we should further, in both scenarios, support investments in natural gas, but obviously the reducing capacity factors threaten the profitability of the plant, and there's a risk, obviously, that the necessary investments in natural gas power infrastructure are not made. But on the other hand, it is needed to keep the lights on. So this is something that I think is a key area for policymakers to look into and make sure that the necessary investments in gas power generation are made to even in a scenario where gas provides only peak load to support other technologies.
Great. No, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Steve. Now, we focused a little bit at the beginning of this discussion very much on the fossil side of things, but moving a bit to the renewable side, we definitely see costs coming down for renewable technologies, both wind and solar being paramount. That is taken into account in the models. So, as those prices come down, as the cost of generation converges between renewable generation and fossil-based generation, why do we need a CO2 price for the power sector? Uwe, could you touch on that?
Yeah. So if we ideally, or to start with, we see some very promising trends for some technologies, how generation costs or investment costs, specific investment costs for some renewables have declined over the recent years to learning effects. That's quite promising, and if one looks just from a pure, I would say, pure economic theory at the problem at some point when renewables could be, the generation cost could be lower than incumbent technologies like coal and gas today, there would be no need for a CO2 price. On the other hand, the situation today is still different, that often generation costs of clean power technologies like renewables are more expensive than the incumbent ones. So it means that we also need initially a CO2 price as a signal for the investors that they go in the long run rather than investing in fossil technologies, increasing the lock-in in fossil generation to go instead into renewable technologies. And then in the long run, we expect, due to learning effects, that even the carbon price will stabilize or even to some extent can decline depending on the technology progress that we are making with low carbon technologies, not just renewables but also CCS.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that. Now, Steve, I want to ask you a question that was touched on in the presentation. Can you just roughly comment on the networks analysis, how that was carried out, and the fact that the investment needed in networks to accommodate the variable renewable integration is actually quite low. Can you just provide some background to the analysis and then just also comment on that aspect?
So yeah, take what we've done in the transmission distribution network is that we model 3 categories: grid extension, grid renewal, and additional costs to integrate renewables. And it's very important here to mention that these are additional costs. So these account for, say, lower capacity factors of variable renewables, or like the longer distance to reach maybe offshore wind parks. So it doesn't mean that, for example, additional T&D networks due to increasing demand would be covered in the category that I call grid extension. So if we build, for example, a new coal power plant, this will be covered entirely in the category grid extension. But if we build an offshore wind park, this will be grid extension plus the additional cost for integration of renewables. So that's accounted for. And what we want to show here is that actually, as we saw in the results before, that the additional cost to integrate renewables are never higher than 10% for our region. And an important factor also that should be raised if we look into grids is that obviously our 2-degree scenario has a lot of energy efficiency across the value chain. This makes that actually there's less demand as lower demand and as lower there's less lower demand, but definitely a lower supply needed. So that means that we need to invest less in the whole infrastructure. So costs tend on that side to be lower.
Okay. Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that was one of the surprising results that we've had in some of our analysis, is that on the network side, the investments or the deployment of variable renewables do not actually increase network investments by that much. And I think that's an encouraging result, and one that we're happy to have found out. Now, within the presentation, we touched on heating and cooling, and why is that neglected? Why is it less covered in the analysis than the electricity side? If you can touch on that, Marcus.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess the honest answer, I don't know, is the short and honest answer, but I can make some speculations. I think the awareness actually is one part of it. I don't think that the awareness of the importance of heat is as high as it should be, and we're trying to change that a little bit now from our side. But I also think that it's a different animal, a different topic, both in terms of how you can analyze it and also what types of policies that you can put in place. So heat is much more local by nature. You can't transport heat as far as you can electricity, or for example, or oil and coal or other energy carriers. It's more difficult. So you've got to have much more hands-on local involvement in order to manage the use of heat. So for example, if you look at the way we use and waste heat in industry, where one industry could discharge very high temperature water, for example, just because they've got no use for it. If there's another industry located next door that actually have use for that water, there's a great synergy to be had. But in order to reap that, you need some kind of coordinated approach to not only energy in general, but also how you plan and locate industries, which is a very different environment to operate in if you're a policymaker than if you say are in charge of transport or electricity systems. So I think there's several layers to this, where many people don't understand just how much heat is wasted, and also it's more difficult from a traditional energy policy perspective to address these failures in the system.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I hope those who are interested in the power sector don't mind us throwing in a thermal energy question. And part of the rationale for that is to make sure that the different energy systems actually consider each other. Part of our theme this year was in the systems approach, looking at the overall energy system. And sometimes we think it's important for those who focus on the thermal energy side of things to consider the electricity or the power system issues, and vice versa. But moving back to the power sector again, one of the questions we had was a comment that non-member countries or developing countries, emerging economies, those are the ones who are building their infrastructure right now. Uwe, could you comment on some of the trends that we're seeing in those regions? And also, because they're building it now, their infrastructure now, are they going to have an easier time meeting the 2DS scenario in their respective regions?
Thank you. If we look at the trends in non-OECD countries, especially if we look at China and India, we see there, as you also saw on on the slides, that we still see, if we look at in absolute terms, it's still that fossil generation is dominating, and also dominating in the new capacity addition. So that's still a trend we see there. Also, one has to say that these countries are also looking to use coal more efficient. So they're introducing policies to make supercritical plants mandatory, for example. In India, they've got these mega projects where it's mandatory to have at least supercritical technology for these projects. So there are improvements, there are policies on the way to ensure that if coal is used at least in the most efficient way. and ideally it will also be an option in the future to link these coal plants to convert them into CCS plants. More positive trend regarding transition to a low-carbon electricity system we see in these emerging economies in the deployment of renewables. So if you look at China, China is not only leading, I mean, to say China is leading in many categories. If you look at it in absolute terms, it's also leading the deployment of renewable technologies like wind, solar PV, and if I go back to the thermal system, also solar water heating. That's a country in absolute terms which is dominating. I guess an important aspect one has to keep in mind for these regions is also that the development of these technologies, so domestic development, production of these technologies can often open opportunity for developing local industry. I mean, it's also happened in China if we look at wind and solar PV. So actually, the plans or the feed-in tariffs that have been introduced in Europe actually did not lead to increase production capacities in Europe, but it's rather than now that we import technology from China. So I guess the Chinese have realized that that's also that transition to a low-carbon energy system also has business opportunities for them. So I guess we're not living anymore in a world where technology is developed in OECD countries and being imported in non-OECD countries. I guess the world becomes much more complex in the terms of the technology interactions, which is actually quite positive because, I mean, non-OECD countries are the countries where we will see in the future the need for increased energy. So if the technology is developed in those countries, from my perspective, I think that's a positive trend.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Now I want to move to the financial issues again, and Marcus. You know, in one of your slides, you talked about how there's a financial rationale to do this. Could you comment, if it's financially viable, why are the markets not enough to make this happen? Why is government intervention required to see a shift away from conventional approaches to more clean energy approaches?
Yeah, of course, that's a very good question. As economists usually say, well, if there were $50 bills flying around on the ground, somebody would pick them up. So, one argument is, well, this is not actually true. This is not such a great economic opportunity as some people like to say. Well, I think the answer to that is, I touched upon it before. Just because this makes sense in the long-term economic perspective does not equal that it makes sense in the short term for an individual investor to do this. So again, the distribution over time and space is enormously challenging to overcome, and government, the role of government is very important there to make sure that the investor that needs to put the money up front also gets the benefits that are high enough to motivate that investment, and that requires policy action. I think the role of the government could also play out in different levels again. The government policies, for example, in the form of a carbon price, will support the operational cash flow of a low-carbon electricity generator, but it will do very little to alleviate the upfront capital cost and the risk of, say, a very high capital or very capital-intensive plant like CCS. So there the government needs to take a much greater role in reducing that risk, especially for the first movers in the technology. For example, through using their access to low-cost capital, maybe through tax credits and so forth. So there are different barriers that does not only have to deal with the operational side of things, but also to risk management and distribution over time that are very important to this.
Great, thank you for that. One of the things that was touched on in the presentation that we haven't spent a lot of time on in the discussion is the issue of nuclear. Now, the modeling results that we have shows nuclear actually still playing a rather significant role. So there's going to be two parts to this question. One is, what if nuclear is not included, or what if the deployment of nuclear is radically decreased? So that's my first question. And then secondly, what needs to happen to see nuclear continue to be used in the power system?
Yeah, thank you. So nuclear, I mean, after Fukushima, it's even more controversial technology. So there's more uncertainty regarding the future of nuclear. So it means also that the costs of nuclear, I mean, as a consequence of the stress tests, for example, are expected to increase if we want to build a nuclear power plant. That then also relates to the previous point when we discussed about the to ensuring the financing for new investments. So in our kind of model analysis, it makes, depending on the CO2 price, it makes sense to invest in new nuclear. In reality, just mobilizing the investment that's needed can be a hurdle. On the other hand, if you look at nuclear in our scenario, it's mainly deployed in countries that after Fukushima still continue to use nuclear. So we talk about Russia, India, China, South Korea. So it's happening. I mean, the deployment's needed, or we see in our scenarios in these countries. If we don't have nuclear in the global electricity system, we didn't really look at a scenario where we totally exclude nuclear. We looked at a scenario where we rather had a more nuanced approach, by saying there will be higher costs for nuclear, also slow deployment due to several non-cost reasons. For example, local opposition of the population. We also did the same for CCS, so we had a combined scenario, low nuclear and no CCS scenario, and there we see that the costs of achieving the 2DS scenario are around $2 trillion higher. So it means it will be more costly to achieve nuclear, but also in terms of CO2 reductions, I mean that probably not only the power sector has to make up for the gap, but also reductions are needed. Can be needed or realized also in other sectors. So that overall the pressure to achieve the reductions needed for the 2DS scenario will become higher.
Great, thank you for that. Well, we're coming to the close. We have a few minutes left, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to go around the table here. We have a range of expertise here and a range of technology focus for the experts around the table. So what I want to do is I want to ask each of them, if you had 1 minute with a policymaker, or let's do the elevator pitch. You rode the elevator with a policymaker who is interested in the electricity system, and you had just a few seconds or 30 seconds to say, you know what, if there's one thing you need to know about the power system, this is it. So I want to do a round table, starting with Steve. What would you want to tell that policymaker from your perspective, from your expertise? What is the most important thing they need to know about the power sector? So Steve, I'll start with you.
I would say remember that the power system needs to be flexible and don't only look at generation but also at the grid and at the demand side.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Going to pass it on to Keith.
Well, I would say, looking at it from a coal perspective, that the average plant efficiency globally is around 33% at the moment. Best practice plant can offers around 46% efficiency. There's a huge potential to improve the existing fleet of plants, and there is ongoing technology development to improve that. So I would urge improvement in the in existing plant and where coal is used to use the best practice technology.
Great, thank you for that, Keith. That was you were going up to the 50th floor with that policymaker. So, but very good advice indeed. So, Uwe, I'm going to pass it over to you. What is one piece of advice that you would want to give?
Yeah, the first thing I would hope that the elevator would get stuck, but I've got more time to talk to the politician. Now, I guess it's going in the direction what Steve said, is important to look at the entire electricity system and the energy system. So I guess the positive aspect to some extent for decarbonizing the electricity sector is we've got several options. We talk about renewables, we talk about nuclear, we can talk about CCS. So that's, I guess, a positive thing. I guess the challenge is really to initiate the transition to deploying these technologies. And also one has to keep in mind that one does not talk just about the generation side, but also takes into account what can happen on the demand side. If we talk again at over the entire energy system, some of the reductions are much harder to achieve in the NTS sectors like transport or buildings, where electricity can play an important role also to contribute to reductions in these sectors.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and one of our questions that we didn't get a chance to touch on asked about that actually. So thank you for that, Uwe. Marcus, you're going to get the last word on this. So what is your one piece of policy advice that you would want to give?
Well, I'll take the high-level view then. I think the most important, and this is, I guess, what goes beyond just the power sector, is to have an investment climate that actually can stimulate this transition. So, of course, one critical piece of that is get the prices right. Right now, the prices do not reflect the true cost of energy, but it also means that having a stable and reasonably, an investment climate that's stable and where investors feel confident that the policies are reasonably predictable, maybe not in the sense that they can know what the policies are, but at least that they can predict what the policy changes and the process to put in place policy changes are reasonably predictable. That we lack, I think, in many countries and in many areas, not only in the non-OECD world, but also in the OECD part of the world. So an investment climate of confidence, I think, is the key thing to establish.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're coming up to the end of our time here, and so I first off want to thank the experts for their information that they provided, but then especially for those who have listened. I want to re-emphasize that if you have any questions that we did not answer, definitely please find us on our website. We do answer these emails when you have specific questions. We'd be happy to engage with you. And just want to make you aware that soon we'll be sending out the announcement for our next webinar, which will be held on November 27th at 1500 Paris time, and the focus will be on transport. So the transport chapter in ETP 2012. Again, I think it'll be another excellent discussion and a chance to really dig into some of the details of the book. So with this, we'll sign off. And we hope that you've enjoyed this discussion today. And of course, we look forward to engaging more in the future and actually seeing what the future will hold. Thank you very much.